It's Emily OFC Podfic. Flashpoint. Written by It's Emily OFC. Read by It's Emily OFC. Chapter 6. The atmosphere in Station 10's engine bay was tense to say the least as the door clicked shut behind Tsunade and the crew's humiliated lieutenant. The remaining team members were lined up along their engine, looking as though they were attempting to stand at attention but had absolutely no experience doing so. Kakashi could feel himself frowning. It wasn't the introduction he would have preferred. He had really only two options when it came to his next move. He could continue on in the same vein Tsunade had and get the crew working immediately on overdue training exercises. This would earn him no favors with the new crew, and there was no guarantee that anyone would even listen to him. Who listens to a substitute teacher? On the other hand, he could release them to leisure and take the time to get to know the crew before setting expectations. But that move, itself, might be read as an indication that he was a pushover and make gaining authority all the more difficult. One of Station 10's crew members coughed, and the sound rang out in the high-ceilinged engine bay. It snapped Kakashi out of his thoughts. How long had he been lost in them? Long enough, it seemed, for things to grow awkward. As he surveyed the crew, most were fidgeting by now. Kakashi had taken his time to observe each of them, while Tsunade had been lecturing them. To the far right was Asuma, whom Kakashi had spent only a moment considering. He knew Asuma well enough. They had been in the academy together and had kept mostly in touch, seeing each other at the very least at various department events. Kakashi hadn't worked with him professionally much, but he knew he was of a solid character and that he knew his stuff, hence his promotion to engineer a few years previously. To his left stood the man who had coughed. Even if Kakashi hadn't seen who it had been, he would have known that it was this guy. He looked positively ill, with bags under his eyes and washed-out-looking skin. Kakashi made a mental note to steer clear of him. It was flu season, after all. Next to him were two younger-looking firefighters. They had been exchanging nervous glances with one another for as long as Kakashi had been watching them. Probies, probably. Next in the lineup was Station 10's only woman firefighter. Kakashi could already sense that she was going to be trouble. She was far shorter than her crewmates, but had more personality than the rest of them combined from what Kakashi could see. Apart from Asuma, she was the only one making eye contact with him, and her expression was easily readable. She wasn't impressed. Last, to the far left, Kakashi had been surprised to recognize Tenzō, the man from the veranda at the department holiday party. He should have put two and two together. He had known that the man was on Asuma's crew, but it just hadn't occurred to him that there would be someone else he knew now in his command. Well, maybe knew was a strong word, but still. Tenzō was avoiding eye contact, much like the majority of the rest of his teammates, but as compared to them, his expression was far less severe. It was neutral, with maybe a hint of a smile. He didn't look tense like the others did. He looked comfortable. The casual department issue attire suited him better than his party getup had. Maybe that was just Kakashi projecting, though. After far too long a silence, Kakashi came to grips with the fact that he couldn't do nothing. He was going to have to make a call on how to proceed. While it may have been 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, Kakashi figured that this crew needed to know right off the bat that he was nothing like Jiraiya. Option 1 it was. "First things first," Kakashi said, allowing his voice to be softer than Tsunade's had been, but still gravely serious. He watched as a few crew members straightened up a bit. "I'm not..." He needn't have worried about deciding, it turned out. The automated dispatch system, as it so often did, saw fit to interrupt at the most inconvenient time possible. Engine 3. Fire alarm activated. 1500 Cedar Street. The calm female voice said as the engine bay was filled with flashing light. Kakashi looked up at the tall ceiling, cursing his luck. Trial by fire it would be. Literally. He looked back to the crew. Everyone seemed to be frozen in place, completely caught off guard by the interruption. "Well?" he asked. "What are you all waiting for?" As if a switch had been flipped, the crew lurched into action, each grabbing their own helmet and jacket from the staging area and climbing up into the engine. While everyone was distracted, Kakashi was allowed a brief moment to himself. He let his shoulders slump and ran a hand through his hair as he sighed out his frustration. When he looked up again, the last of the crew was scrambling into their positions on Engine 3, the passenger side door hung open and waiting. The lieutenant's seat. It was an unwanted invitation, but Kakashi had no choice but to accept. He squared his shoulders, closed the gap between himself and the door in 2 long strides, and hoisted himself up into the seat. 1500 Cedar Street. That was an address Kakashi knew well. It was the local high school. Knowing the addresses of schools was just part of firefighter life. Between alarms set off by cafeteria mishaps, woodshop projects gone wrong, and plain old prank alarm pulls, you could ask any firefighter you knew for the local high school's address and they would be able to rattle it off with ease. Call-outs to schools almost never amounted to anything more than a waste of time, but firefighters did their duty and responded with lights flashing and sirens blaring each time. It was a short drive, sirens or not, and Asuma was quiet in the driver's seat. For that, Kakashi was grateful. He and Asuma had a familiarity that he would rather not showcase as an example to the rest of the crew if they were to take him seriously. It was bad enough that transferee, Tenzō, had glimpsed it at the holiday party. As they pulled up alongside the high school, their view of the building was somewhat obstructed by the several hundred students milling about in front of it. They were loosely organized in lines, probably per the institution's evacuation protocol, but it would be evident to anyone observing the scene that not a single one of the teenagers was taking the threat of fire seriously. That, honestly, didn't really mean anything as far as Kakashi was concerned. In his experience, whether there was a true fire or not, high schoolers nearly always assumed that there wasn't, and viewed the evacuation process as a lucky break from their studies and an opportunity to socialize with friends. That being said, there were no obvious signs of fire that he could see. The school was a decent size, though, so of course they would have to sweep the building to confirm that there wasn't any imminent danger. The nice thing about call-outs to schools, as opposed to residential call-outs, was that parking was easy. As Asuma pulled the engine up alongside the bright red designated fire lane, through the window Kakashi saw a plump man in a dress shirt and slacks giving him what looked like an apologetic smile. When the engine halted, Kakashi exited quickly, hearing the telltale clatter of several other doors on the engine opening, meaning that his new crew was ready for action. The smiling man approached Kakashi, holding a hand out for him to shake. It was an unhurried gesture that gave Kakashi foresight into what he was about to say. "Principal Funeno," he said by way of introduction. "So sorry to have made you all come out here. I'm afraid we already caught the culprit who pulled the alarm as a prank." As Kakashi shook the principal's hand, he saw the man glance quickly to his right. Kakashi followed his gaze and saw a stern-looking staff member chastising an unimpressed-looking teen whose arms were held out to his side to avoid getting the incriminating blue ink from his hands on his clothing. Kakashi turned back to the man in front of him. "Acting Lieutenant Hatake," he replied. "I'm glad to hear that. We'll still need to sweep the building just to be safe. It's protocol." The man nodded understandingly. "Of course," he agreed. "Just—" He glanced back over his shoulder at the hundreds of students milling about the schoolyard. The semblance of order and lines was beginning to atrophy. "We'll get your students back in the building as quickly as we can, Principal Funeno," Kakashi assured him. and the man nodded gratefully. Kakashi turned around to face his crew. Most of them were not, as he had expected, standing by awaiting his instruction. In fact, the vast majority of Station 10's crew could have been mistaken for high schoolers themselves if not for their uniforms. They were caught up in what looked to be an animated conversation with one of the students, a blonde boy who wasn't even pretending to be where he was supposed to be. He was beaming as he shouted whatever anecdote he was telling, pausing intermittently to laugh and point at the moody, ink-covered teen who'd pulled the alarm. Tenzō was the only crew member seemingly not involved in the discussion. He stood alone, in front of the broad side of the engine, alternating between staring nervously at Kakashi and staring nervously at the distracted crew. "Do you want me to get their attention?" Tenzō asked. Kakashi was sure he meant well, but the last thing Tenzō needed, already being a transferee, was for the rest of his crew to see him as the new lieutenant's errand boy. "No." He shook his head, approaching the crew on his own. "We need to sweep the building," he said, loudly enough to interrupt, not waiting for a lull in the conversation. The crew and the blonde teen turned to look at him. They were quiet for a beat. "Sweep the building?" Anko asked, as if Kakashi had ordered her to scrub a toilet. "It was a prank alarm pull. There is no fire, Lieutenant." "It's still protocol," Tenzō said from behind Kakashi's shoulder. Kakashi hadn't known he was there and looked back at him when he spoke. His expression was firm and determined. It seemed there would be no saving Tenzō from earning a reputation as the teacher's pet. Still, Kakashi appreciated the support. Wait! The teen suddenly interrupted, his face having contorted from a jovial smile into an expression of intense scrutiny. "Who the heck are you? Where's Four Eyes?" "Ibizu got temporarily transferred," Kotetsu responded, and Kakashi watched the teen's eyebrows shoot up in surprise. "Oh, and Jiraiya retired," Izumo added. "What?" the student demanded. "How come no one told me? Somebody should have told me." Kakashi cleared his throat. He didn't like having to give instruction more than once. "Oh, sorry, sir," Izumo said at once, and Kakashi was grateful for how genuine it sounded. "This is Naruto. He's part of the high school's volunteer firefighting pro—" "I don't care who he is," Kakashi interrupted, no longer grateful. "Sweep the building. Now." There was silence again, but it was a loud kind of silence, the friction between Kakashi and the team's bad habits audible to anyone in the vicinity. Finally, Asuma pressed off the back of the engine where he had been leaning, gesturing for the crew to head into the building. "You heard the man. Go sweep," he said. As the engineer, it was his duty to stay with the engine. It was enough to spur action. The group headed towards the front entrance of the school building. Tenzō led the charge, determined and sure. Kotetsu and Izumo followed, looking around confusedly. Hayate trudged along behind them, and Anko trailed begrudgingly. Kakashi couldn't help but notice that the teen, Naruto, had yet to move, and when he turned to face him, the boy was still apparently scoping him out, eyes narrowed as he leaned forward into Kakashi's personal space. Kakashi blinked at him. "Do you need something?" he asked tiredly. "How old are you?" Naruto responded. "Because you look young, but your hair is gray." "I'm 100 years old," Kakashi answered flatly, before turning around and heading back towards the passenger seat of the engine, ignoring Naruto's shout of incredulity. Asuma had retreated back to the driver's seat, and at least inside the truck he could avoid more questions like that while they waited for the crew to finish their sweep. As his door slammed shut, the noise of the school student population, which had steadily been getting louder the longer they had been there, was muffled. Kakashi allowed himself to relax back into his seat, closing his eyes. He was silently cursing Tsunade for putting him up to this. If Station 10's crew was this much trouble even at a false alarm call-out... Kakashi's thoughts were interrupted by Asuma's deep chuckle. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else right now, Hatake," he said. And when Kakashi opened his eyes to look at him, the man was smiling. Kakashi shrugged noncommittally, even though Asuma was right. "I can't believe you made them do a sweep even though it was a false alarm," Asuma continued, looking out the windshield, eyes apparently trained on the guilty teen who had given up keeping the ink sequestered to his hands, his sweatshirt now smeared with the stuff. "It's protocol, Asuma. Come on, you know that," Kakashi replied. The odds were stacked against him as it was. He didn't need a critic in Asuma, too. Yeah, Asuma agreed, now watching with fascination as the culprit used his fingers to draw a smudgy blue upside-down triangle on each of his cheeks while the staff member next to him was looking away. He used his phone's camera as a mirror. "It's not how our crew is used to doing things, though. Did you see Anko's face when you said it?" Kakashi ran a hand over his face. "I hate this," he admitted from behind his palm. "Everyone's gonna think I'm a hard ass." Asuma laughed again. "Not everyone," he placated, reaching a hand across the seat divide to clap it on Kakashi's shoulder. He squeezed. "Not me, when I've known you since the academy." Kakashi didn't react. It wasn't much consolation. What would the crew think if they knew you got reprimanded in the academy for reading a smut novel while on the job? This got a reaction out of him. Kakashi sat upright and fixed Asuma with a glare. "It's not smut," he corrected. "And the job was already done. We were just—" "Right, Asuma agreed insincerely, and it made Kakashi fight a grin as he sat back again. It hadn't been a flattering memory, but Asuma's words had reminded him of better times, simpler times. They reminded him that, as much of a challenge as this assignment was sure to be, at least he had a friend to lean on. They sat in that amicable silence for a few minutes, watching the now war-painted alarm puller receive a scathing talking to. "How does it feel, though?" Asuma asked, breaking the silence. "To be back in the lieutenant seat." Kakashi frowned. "It's just temporary, Asuma," he said, voice low as a warning. "It suits you," Asuma replied emphatically, ignoring that warning. Kakashi had nothing to say to that, and a knock on the window signaled the end of the conversation. Kakashi turned to his right to see Hayate's face on the other side of the glass, inches away, knuckles raised. He coughed on the window pane, causing it to fog up, and Kakashi grimaced involuntarily. He was protected by the glass, of course, but the fact that this man had just coughed in his face from 5 inches away was off-putting to say the least. He waited for Hayate to step back onto the curb before rolling the window down and giving him a questioning look. "We're all clear, Lieutenant," he said. "Please don't," Kakashi started, but Asuma chose that moment to honk the engine's formidable horn, drowning out the rest of his sentence and causing the vast majority of the crowd outside, including the crew, to jump in surprise. 10-4, Asuma shouted, flashing a grin at Kakashi. "Let's roll out!" It's Emily OFC Podfic.